So what we're going to start off with today is talking about what type of hay is best for horses. I know yesterday we heard about, the hay shortage and how weather impacted hay. And then we heard about how to look at hay quality and how to test your hay. So now we're going to kind of put that aside a little bit. And now if we had our choice of any hay in the world, what would our horses really need? So let's start off with that in mind. So just a little bit of background on hay first and what hay can do for your horses. Really, pasture or any good quality forage can provide our horses with 100% of their nutrients. And yes, I said 100%. So horses at maintenance or even some that are lightly exercising should not need anything else in their diet if it is a good quality forage. However, if the horses are lactating or growing, they probably are going to need some extra protein, some energy, and maybe some minerals. Or if they're exercising at even higher levels, they're probably going to need extra energy and maybe some protein depending on the hay that you have. So if you're feeding these maintenance horses or these lightly working horses, really any horse at all, even one that's exercising, they should consume at least 1.5% of their body weight per day in forage. So that ends up being about 3/4 of the ration. I always tell my students I am not a math teacher. I like to do easy math. So when I'm using an example horse, I use this 1,000-pound horse. It's much easier to calculate 1.5% of their body weight. It is 15 pounds a day. So if right now you're going, I have no idea how much that is in terms of pounds, I have no idea how much my horse is eating, it might not be a bad idea to go get a bathroom scale or a kitchen scale and find out. I know people say, oh, I throw it a bale and, 2 horses eat it, over the course of a day. Well, then weigh a bunch of bales and see what they average out to be. I know that's how we sometimes do it at Rutgers. We'll weigh a bunch of bales and it'll be 45, 49, 50, 55, 49, 49, and we'll get an average and think, okay, it's about a 50-pound bale a day. Then you can get a sense of how much your horse is eating. Or if you go by the flake, weigh a flake. On average, a flake is about 4 pounds, but I've seen some that are really skinny or really light, it's going to be less. So weigh your average flakes, and that way you can get a sense of how much your horse is on right now and make sure that it's on at least 3/4 of the ration in their hay. So it says up here pasture or hay, and this is a hay talk. So we're going to deviate from pasture, but really hay can be the same as pasture, only it's cut or dried. Granted, the picture down here at the bottom, that's an alfalfa field, and typically horse people don't graze on alfalfa, but in essence, it's the same thing. You're going to cut and dry the grass. And really the nutrients in this forage depend on when it's cut. And we're going to talk about this just a little bit in terms of what it means to you feeding your horses. So feeding a quality forage can really reduce the cost of your other feed, because if you have 100% of the nutrients coming from the hay, you can significantly reduce what you're feeding in terms of grain or supplements or really anything else. It's also been shown through quite a few studies over the years that low forage, high concentrate diets, so this means they might not be getting 3/4 of their ration in hay. They might be getting huge, giant buckets of grain, is associated with a lot of problems. Colic and gastric ulcers comes to the top of the list, and this has been studied an awful lot by a lot of groups across the country and actually across the world. There's a lot of gastrointestinal disorders like acidosis and a lot of other metabolic disorders. Laminitis can be one in certain horses that are prone for insulin resistance or equine metabolic syndrome. And also things like tying up or exertional rhabdomyolysis. And this is common in some of the light horse, racehorse breeds, Arab standardbreds, thoroughbreds, etc. So not only that, but these low fiber or low roughage diets create a lack of fiber in our horses, or chew time. We call it chew time because horses are meant to be grazing or eating 12 to 18 hours a day. And actually my graduate students has done a lot with GPS monitors and looking at chew time. and has found that even though a lot of this research was done years ago, it does hold true. Even horses nowadays that are put in, say, a 4-acre field do still eat, you know, a good 3/4 or more during the day. So if they're only fed limited amounts of forage and they scarf down their grain, they need something else to put their mouth on during the rest of the day. So what they're going to do, they're going to chew on sheds or fence boards. And they might not even just chew, they might actually start to windsuck as well, like this guy here that has the non-functioning cribbing collar on. So regardless of type of hay, and we're going to get to type of hay in just a minute, but regardless of type of hay, the hay should be harvested when plants are younger. They'd be green, soft, free of weeds, mold, and other foreign objects. And we heard a great talk from Melissa Bravo yesterday about what might be happening with our hay supply this year. Because our weather wasn't optimal, growing conditions, there might be some suboptimal hay around. And some of the things you need to watch out for will be some of the weeds, you know, maybe mold, but other foreign objects, even rodents, pests, things like that. So we really need to be cautious and really look closely at the hay that you're feeding to your horses. You know, obviously you don't want to feed anything like this that is full of mold. Horses cannot ingest mold, absolutely not. If you ever see a bale like that from your hay grower or your hay supplier, they would get back on the phone immediately and say, come pick up your hay. They should not be eating that. However, hay that might look like that, while it's sun bleached on the outside, is still nice and green on the inside. And really, hay is cured from the sun, so there is going to be some sun bleaching depending on how long it was left out to dry. But just because this bale is a little bleached on the outside, I wouldn't be too worried about it. And then here's a bale. Looks like it's a mix of maybe some orchard grass, a little bit of alfalfa in there as well, kind of a mixed grass hay. And again, it looks like some of it is sun bleached over on this side, and some of it might be a little bit greener. But really, it all boils down to when the plant is harvested. So let's start looking at some types of hay first. So with your grass hay, I'm talking about Timothy, orchard grass, brome, fescues, those sorts of things, and we'll get into those in just a minute. But typically they're moderate in calcium, Ca, I abbreviate calcium. Their protein can be a bit lower. I've seen it as low as 4 to 5%, and yes, that is very low. And I've seen it up around 12 or 14%. So in terms of horses that are on, you know, their maintenance diet, not doing a whole lot, they can get away with about 8 to 10% protein in their diet, so that's not bad. However, if they are pregnant or, you know, lactating or growing animals, they should be closer to 14 to 16%. So in this case, this grass hay wouldn't be adequate for them. However, grass hays are pretty low in any vitamin content, much lower actually than legumes and much lower than pasture. Because if you think about it, hay is left in the sun to dry, right? When you go into CVS or GNC or any place and you're going to look for your own vitamins, what do the bottles look like? Think about it. They're either white, they're opaque, they're dark, they're not clear. Vitamins do not come in clear bottles because UV radiation denatures the vitamins. So that's exactly what we've done to our hays. Regardless of the content, if you can, which they can out west, but out east we can't do this, basically cut it in the morning and bale it by the afternoon because their climate is so dry. Then there might be a little bit higher vitamin content because it hasn't been left outside to dry quite as long. However, here, the sun really does denature a lot of the vitamins. DE is digestible energy. So our digestible energy in these hays is going to be about 0.8 on the low end to 1 megacal per pound. And I know you don't go to your hay guy and you get a feed label that has all the nutrients on it. And that's why we had Hank talk about testing your hay to find out what exactly is in it. He talked about that yesterday. So if you want to know more about that, you can listen to his webinar when we get it archived. So what I mentioned about the nutritional value, it's based on the age of the plant at harvest. So it doesn't really matter in terms of what the hay grower does at planting. What it matters is when it's harvested. So typically your younger plants, and they're going to have more leaves, less seed heads, or much shorter or smaller seed heads, they're going to be higher in protein and lower in fiber. And it's going to be just the opposite with these older plants that have longer, larger seed heads. They're going to be lower in protein and higher in fiber. So there's an inverse relationship between the fiber content and the protein content. Now, the length of the stem to the seed head is what's critical, not necessarily the length of the seed head. And I'll show you some pictures here in just a little bit that deal with the seed heads. And that really is what reflects the age of the plant. So ideally, if you really are looking for a good quality hay, you want to see lots of leaves, very few seed heads. And if they do have them, the length of that stem should be about 1 inch or less long in order to get to that seed head. So here's actually just a little bit of a picture of some Timothy. This is a pretty good quality Timothy. I only see a few stems here. There's a stem, but there's mostly leaves. There's another stem, but most of it is leaves. Where this is basically the same field cut. It's typically a second cutting, but really cutting doesn't matter. You can get a really good quality first cutting if you cut it really early, but most hay growers don't, because their yield is going to go down considerably if they cut it too early. So that's when we usually get these really long seed heads and really long stems. So particularly, let's look at this Timothy seed head here. This stem, granted, it's bent over, but it's this whole thing there. It's probably about 3 inches long. So what it looks like in schematic is this. So let's look at these reproductive stages. So these 3, 1, 2, 3, are all these reproductive stages of the, actually there's 4 of them there. Now this is a very young, immature plant. Look at how long the leaves are. Look at how small its seed head is, and it's got a very short stem to the leaf. This one's pretty good as well. While the seed head is bigger, it does have a very short stem. However, now the stem is getting longer and longer on that seed head, making it more and more mature. And this is true for any of our grasses. And these are the cool season grass hays that we're going to see most commonly in this area, in the Northeast, even in most of the Mid-Atlantic region. So Timothy, I hate to tell you, horse folks, it is not the end-all be-all for our horses. I know everybody loves to have a Timothy, and typically the hay growers know that. That's why they're going to price it higher. I guarantee you, I know many of the hay growers in this area, and their Timothy, regardless of quality, is going to be higher than most other hays. It's usually palatable. Horses usually like it. However, it can be very over mature when it's cut a lot of the times. And if it's harvested really late, can be very low in protein. We've tested some hays, like I said, that are 4 to 6% protein in some of these hays. And a lot of the horses are getting that as a majority of their diet. Well, guess what? They're deficient in their protein based on these hays. So what do you do if your hay grower doesn't have a good supply of Timothy? Well, look at something else. They might have a really nice orchard grass, or even an orchard grass that might be a little nicer than the Timothys they have. They're usually nice and soft, and typically only the first cutting has the seed heads. I actually was just over at a farm that was local to me. He had very mature orchard grass, very mature Timothy, but he had a beautiful orchard grass that had a lot of leaves and no seed heads. And I guarantee you that protein was probably testing around 12 to 14%. Fescues, while they're not quite as common in this region, when I did my graduate work down at Virginia Tech in Virginia, they use tall fescue hay quite a lot. It's not usually palatable unless you can harvest it early. So a lot of the hay growers there did know this, and they did harvest it fairly early, and we had some good fescue hays. Brome grass, I do know a few hay growers here that do have some brome grass. While the leaf blades are typically wider, and it will have a similar palatability and nutrient content to Timothy. Again, if you wait too long, it's going to get too mature, and the palatability will go down along with the protein content. And then there's a lot of these grass mixes. Typically, if you go to a hay grower or a hay farmer and they've got a grass mix, it's typically going to be a Timothy orchard grass mix, but there might also be some other grasses mixed in there. It might even have a little sprinkling of some alfalfa or some legumes. So some grasses that you might have heard of but aren't typically used in our area are our warm season grasses. So these warm season grasses are things like coastal Bermuda grass. Coastal Bermuda grass is very common. You also hear it called coastal hay. Coastal hay is what they feed a lot of times in Florida. And it's the primary grass hay in some of the southern states. It can be very fibrous and low protein if it is harvested late. So a lot of people are very concerned about impaction colic. Because it is very stemmy, very fibrous. The good thing about it is it's also typically low in the non-structural carbohydrates, or these NSCs. And these NSCs are what we, if you have a horse that is metabolically prone to have laminitis or insulin resistance, you're really concerned about that. And I get a lot of questions, what do I feed my horse? And I was like, well, move to Florida and feed it Bermuda grass, because typically these warm season grasses are lower in these non-structural carbohydrates. But you do need to be careful. Again, they can get very, very fibrous for our horses. Teff grass is one grass that, there's a few places that have grown it around here, but it's not super common because it is an annual grass. It needs to be replanted every year. It was a new variety a few years ago. Now it's become a little more common, especially in the upper Northwest. The upper Northwest parts of Idaho and Washington have really found good luck with seeding and having some really good quality teff grass hay. It was a seed that came from Africa and is used a lot in Australia as well. It is pretty hardy and very low in NSC. We're talking, most hays are going to be in the range of about 12 to 15%, but these hays are going to be probably lower than 6% of the NSCs. I know in this area we've seen some of these teff grass hays with an inverse or a very low level of calcium, so it makes an inverse calcium to phosphorus ratio. However, when I asked my colleague in Washington when she was working with it, that's not something that they've typically seen. So I think it may be more of a soil problem. Now, reed canary grass is also a hay that can be fed. It is low in the non-structural carbohydrates as well. However, I haven't seen it fed a whole lot in this area either. I had some colleagues down at Maryland do a digestibility trial with it. And if it is left to get pretty mature, the digestibility goes down considerably in this hay. So if you do find any, make sure that it's on the more immature side and has been baled fairly early, because it'll also not be as palatable for them. Then we get on to the legume hays. Pretty much alfalfa is the legume hay that everybody knows of. We also have things like clover, even some trefoil can be found in some of these legume hays. Now in these, there is about 75% of the nutrition is actually found in the leaves. And we're talking about really high protein, 15 to 26% in some of these bales. Really high calcium. You saw on the other one, it was about 0.8% calcium, but this is well over 1. I've even seen some much higher than that. They'll also have high potassium, vitamin A and E are going to be much higher, and a much higher calorie content. So let's just look at this one. While it does say 1, I've seen some about 1.2 to 1.3 megacals per pound as well. So while many people think that alfalfa is a bad word, or any legumes are a bad word because it can cause colic or founder, this is actually not the case. If you're really careful when you're feeding the hay, you introduce it slowly and you make sure to not overfeed it, it's a perfectly good hay source. And actually, I prefer it, or prefer it at least as an addition to some of our hay for horses that especially need a little bit higher forage or a little bit higher protein content. While they are a little bit more prone to mold than the grass hays, if they're baled right, it shouldn't be as much of a concern. So you can actually see these bales here. This one actually has some big clover leaves to it. You can see the large leaves. Those aren't weeds. That's actually some clover hay in it. And then here's the very small leaves or leaves that are in alfalfa. And when you're looking for maturity here, you actually want to see it more in the full bloom, which means that it would have many more leaves than stems as well. So moving on from here, I've told you what a good hay is and what should be good for your horses. But if you were on the webinar last night, you know that it's going to be a real challenge this year to get some good quality hay. And like I said, I've seen some around, but you know, the price is going to be premium and it's not going to be easy. So what do? Say you have an exercising horse that's going to be training all year, or a horse that, you know, is pregnant and is due to foal in March. What do? Well, you need to add some legume for sure, but you can also add some of these forage alternatives. So some of these forage alternatives or forage substitutes, out of all of them, my favorite is a hay cube. And the reason why I like hay cube, probably more than any other of the forage alternatives or substitutes I'm going to talk about, is because they slow down chew time. So, and I'm talking about comparing them to a thing like an alfalfa pellet or beet pulp or wheat bran or something like that that might be high fiber. The cubes take a lot longer to chew, so it slows down their ingestion rate a lot, and that will decrease the risk of them possibly chewing on your fence boards or something like that we saw earlier. Now you can pretty much get any type of hay cube under the sun. I've seen usually mostly alfalfa or alfalfa timothy mix. I've even seen some alfalfa oat cubes, so they might have some cereal grain mixed in. And usually these can be used to replace either all or part of the hay ration. And really they could be on a one-to-one basis. So if they were feeding 15 pounds of hay and you no longer have a good hay source, there can be 15 pounds of cubes. I just wouldn't be feeding them all at once, spread them out across the course of the day. There's typically less waste in these cubes because you can put them in a bucket and they kind of stay contained. If one falls out of the bucket, typically the horses will eat them. And they can be fed soaked or dry. Let that soak in. Yes, they can be fed dry. And actually, I know some horses that will not eat them soaked. They only want them dry. Now, a lot of people are worried that they're too hard on their teeth or they can choke. Well, if your horse bolts food normally and is a really fast eater, then yeah, it might choke on anything. But if they are, you know, don't normally choke on other feeds, then they're probably not going to choke on these. I've had just as much success feeding, and actually my graduate student just got done with a feeding trial using strictly hay cubes as 100% of the diet. We fed them completely dry for a course of about 4 months, not had any problems with them. The thing about feeding them soaked is, you know, some horses, especially older horses, if they need them soaked to help break them up as they're chewing, that'll help. Also, in the winter, a lot of times these are fed and people want to increase their water consumption. Well, that's great. If you want to increase their water consumption by adding water to the cubes, I have no problems with that. That's actually a good idea. So what about some other high fiber roughages? Well, things like beet pulp. Beet pulp is a byproduct of the sugar beet industry. However, contrary to popular belief, it is very low in starch and sugar. The only time you're going to have a very high sugar beet pulp is if they've added molasses to it. And a lot of times, things like these pellets down here are going to have molasses added to it. That's why they put it in a pellet. But typically, you can feed it in the raw form, kind of looks like bits of shoe leather, or like I said, the pellets here. It's typically a little higher quality, but it has a really nice, rapidly fermentable source of fiber. So especially for older horses that might have a little bit of a compromise to their digestive system, this is actually really good because it's not very hard on their bodies to digest. Like I mentioned, also a little bit higher in calories, but you know, again, you still have to worry about some of the vitamins as well. Wheat bran is another forage or fiber alternative. I won't say forage alternative, I will say fiber alternative. It's a byproduct of the flour industry. It does have very high fermentable fiber, just like the beet pulp does. It can be very high in protein, but the problem is it's also very high in phosphorus. So if it's fed for long periods of time, it can actually invert the ratio of calcium to phosphorus, and that means it's going to interfere with the absorption of calcium into bone. So I would not recommend feeding wheat bran on a daily basis, or unless you might have a little bit of legume added to it as well to help counteract that low calcium in it. Also, contrary to popular belief, it is not a laxative. It does not increase fecal water. It is high in fiber, but again, a lot of hays and other forages are high in fiber. It is not a laxative. I put this one in here just for fun, and yes, straw was not a typo. Straw can be used as a forage. It is very low energy, very low protein, very low everything, but it will give the horses that chew factor, right? It'll give them that sense of, let's put my mouth on something that's not the fence boards or the shed. Now, will they colic? Well, if they're not used to it and they inhale it, yes, they could. And I know that's why a lot of people shy away from putting their horse on a straw bedding when they're not used to it. So they should be introduced to it at very slow periods of time. Why would you ever want to do this? Well, say, for example, that laminitic horse or the fat little pony that really needs to be on very low quality hay with not a lot of nutrients, but needs to put their mouth on something, that's when this is good for. However, if you're going to use it, do not use any with the long awns or what they call like a bearded wheat straw. You should always, use the beardless, and this is actually, they feed beardless wheat a lot in California. I was out there doing a bunch of teaching one year, and was fascinated by how much wheat straw they actually do, and even wheat hay, oat hay. They feed a lot of cereal grain hays. So just be careful with these awns. It's the same thing with foxtail, and I know Melissa mentioned foxtail yesterday in the webinar. You really need to steer away from that with horses because you're going to have an awful lot of vet bills if some of these awns get stuck or lodged in the mouth. They cause some pretty bad ulcers. And your horse will go off feed because it just hurts too much. So I'm just going to close with a few slides to answer the question of what do I do this year when I really can't find good quality hay, and meaning maybe the hay is inadequate in protein and energy. So an adult horse is going to require that 0.8 to 1 megacals per pound. That's what they require. Well, we remember that most feed hays are going to fall in there, and it's about 8% of protein daily. However, if you have these young horses or these lactating horses, they require much more than that. So while your average adult horse might be okay on these not so great quality hays, some of these younger horses or even some of the exercising ones that need a lot more energy might not be. So what do? Well, you can try to find better hay, but again, that might be a little tricky. You can add moderate amounts of a more dense, and it should say dense feed stuff here, like a grain. Or if they need higher protein, you can add some of these balancer pellets in there that may not have more calories, but they have more of the other nutrients like protein, vitamins, and minerals. Or you can just find a nice legume hay or the cubes. Some of these alfalfa cubes, this is really where they would come into play here and be a nice addition to some lower quality hay during this time. So what about these hays if the minerals are in balance? Say we have that calcium to phosphorus ratio that is off or too low. A lot of these sandy pastures that are grown, especially, or the grasses that are grown in southern New Jersey or Maryland, they might have very low levels of calcium, and a lot of the other minerals might be deficient. So in this case, you'll do a lot of the same things that I just mentioned. You'll want to look for a feed mineral supplement, like a ration balancer or a balancer pellet. Any company has one. You can go to any feed store and look for one. You can also look to supplement alfalfa again or any other legume, hay or cube. Or find someone who might have a legume mixed hay or something that has even just 30% legume in that hay is really going to help with that. And not to talk more or repeat what Hank said last night in the webinar, but if you're really unsure what your hay has, it is really a good idea to get it tested. And I know we talked about not making recommendations, so I'm not actually recommending it. However, Equine Analytical Laboratories is the lab that we use at Rutgers when we do all of our research samples. They have a whole bunch of different packages that range from, you know, less than $20 to over $80. So it really depends on what you want. The one question that I get quite a lot is about these horses that are metabolically prone or need to have these low sugar hays or low starch hays. What do we do? Well, I joked around about move to Florida and feed them a grass, warm season grass hay. Well, if you can't do that, then here's your alternative. If you soak your hays in water for about 30 minutes, you really only need about 15 to 30 minutes. It doesn't need to be very long. And it can be in cold water. If you use too much warm water, then you're going to start to remove some of the protein and some of the minerals. But you leave it in there for about 30 minutes. You dump out the water, and then you're removing about 30% of the non-structural carbohydrates. And I know I hear people say, oh, I can't do that in the winter. Well, 15 to 30 minutes. That's all it needs. So that's really, if you're doing it, you know, morning and night feeding, add the water when you get into the barn. By the time you got the grain scooped or by the time you go through with the grain, your hay is ready to go. So really, I highly recommend this for any horse that is laminitic or possibly has some metabolic issues. So with that being said, I'll end. I know we don't need to really take any questions verbally, but if you want to ask them in chat as we're switching over presentations here, I can definitely answer some of the questions. Or if you have some later, here is my email. Feel free to email me anytime. But thank you very much.
Good evening. Tonight I want to talk to you about winter feeding for ruminant animals. I'm Dr. Michael Westendorf, Extension Specialist at Rutgers University, and we want to spend some time talking to you this evening about how we're going to feed animals during the winter. Budgeting our feed supplies. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to determine what animals there are to be fed on a farm, inventory those animals, and I'll talk more with you about those in a moment. We're going to determine nutrient requirements for those animals, different classifications of animals, ages, etc., stage of life. We're going to inventory available feed supplies. Do we have enough feed to get to through the winter, or are we going to have to purchase another form of feed? Determine the feed quality. If we do have to purchase feed, what's the quality of that feed? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call environmental management. Environmental management being cold stress, how we're going to deal with adverse conditions during the winter. Some of the classes we're going to be looking at as we feed our animals are, first is lactating animals, animals that have an animal with a calf at their side, or a kid, or a lamb. Gestating animals before calving, lambing, kidding. The youngest animals, calves, kids, lambs, maybe still nursing. Replacing animals that we're going to be keeping for use in the breeding herd someday. Growing animals that we're going to be sold for meat. Bred young stock. Older replacements who have probably already been bred. Males for use on the farm. And some groups for special feeding. And these animals are all going to vary by age and group, etc. Lactating animals are going to be one of the what I think is the most important single group to be fed. Adult cows and ewes must provide milk for their offspring as well as regain condition lost during the birthing process. It's not uncommon for an adult cow to lose a couple hundred pounds during the birthing process, and it's going to be important for that animal not only to have enough to be able to provide milk for their calf, but as well as to gain some condition back. And that's going to go really for all of our domestic mammals, but true for ruminants, cows, sheep, and goats. Another classification is going to be gestating animals prior to lambing, kidding, or calving. If those adults don't have enough condition as they're getting close to the calving, lambing, or kidding time, it's going to be important for those animals to gain some condition in the latter part of gestation. Now, this is something to be a little careful with because overfeeding a thin animal during that period could cause some other health problems for that animal as well. But if an animal's under condition prior to giving birth, they're going to have to provide extra hay, provide the right quality of grain for that animal if they need to gain some weight. Might be that those animals need to be separated. Under conditioned animals might need to be separated for special feeding for those animals. Calves, kids, and lambs, young stock. Young animals can receive mother's milk when they're youngest as they grow and are weaned. A good quality hay of some kind, or maybe a commercial starter or grain mix as they grow. Replacement animals. Now these are the animals that have grown, the females generally, they're going to be kept for breeding in our herd, and we need to feed them an adequate diet, generally consisting mostly of forage, or if not, or maybe even completely of forage, depending on the quality of pasture. But probably some extra grain is going to be needed for most of these animals at some point during their growing period. Important to make sure there's enough energy in the diet. Fiber is important to make sure that the proper functioning of the rumen. Sometimes we might have some market animals that are mixed in with those animals for a time and receiving a similar kind of a diet. We'll also get a situation called, that we're going to call compensatory growth. Animals that have been underfed or are underconditioned, let's just say underconditioned for some reason, are going to need to put on some extra weight, and they will compensate if given adequate amounts of feed. So animals that maybe were diseased at young, or scoured, or parasitized, or for some reason poor doers, it's going to be important that they gain some extra weight, and they will compensate. Not animals will. Some animals, like I said, are just what they call poor doers, and they're not generally going to do as well. Breeding males, that's bulls, rams, bucks, can possibly be fed the general herd grain mix, provided there's some the access is limited and there's some forage available. If males are in good condition, the general herd mix plus hay is probably sufficient. Under or over conditioned animals, again, may need some special type of attention. Feed supplies. Well, if you don't have enough hay to get through the winter months, or other feeds, silage for example, to get through the other winter months, you might have to purchase some extra forage. That might be a good option. It's possible in many years that there will be some available hay which may be purchased, brought in from other parts of the country. Sometimes that can be pretty expensive. So when that happens, it's important to look for other alternatives, and we'll talk about a few other alternatives in a moment. It's essential that you have a forage testing program in place, particularly if you're buying hay from someone else, from another location, a plan for how you're going to evaluate whether that's good feed or not. I like to show this slide in different presentations I give, just so people understand how forage quality will change over the course of a growing season. Now on the bottom, you can see on the bottom axis there's grasses and legumes, and as you go from the leafiest area on the far left axis, you see that the digestibility of the feed. And when I say digestibility, what do I mean? I mean that what is digested as a percentage of the total. So if I say something is 70% digestible, that means it's 70% of what's there is going to be digested by the animal. That's pretty high. Generally 60 or 70% digestibility on many feeds is pretty good. But if digestibility is as it shows on some of at the end of the bloom period, it's less than 50% digestible. So as a feed grows, we're going to go from high digestibility and lower yield, higher intake, to whereas as that forage matures, digestibility is going to be less, the animal's intake is going to be less, and the amount of dry matter yield is going to be less as well. So we want to try to maximize those. If we're feeding bloomed out hay of some kind, whether it's a grass or a legume, then those animals are not going to, maybe that's not going to be as good a forage as they need to be consuming. You might need to find a better quality forage. So you want to aim more to this kind of a middle section in here where digestibility and yield are kind of compromised for quality. You've got 60% digestibility, and you've got higher levels of intake at that level, and you hopefully maximize yield. So always be aware of that. And this next slide kind of shows that. This is alfalfa hay that's fed to steers, and we go from pre-bud to all the way to full bloom, and crude protein is 23% in pre-bud, and it's only 14% at full bloom. The ADF, and Hank mentioned ADF and NDF, that's acid detergent fiber. He mentioned that last night. At a pre-bud stage, it's 21% ADF, which is fairly low. But when we go to full bloom, ADF is 43%. And when ADF gets that high, we know that digestibility is going to go down. We know that the dry matter intake is going to go down as well. If we want to maximize, and ultimately we want to maximize pounds of gain, and we're going to do that at the best quality alfalfa. At the pre-bud stage, they're going to get roughly 2.2 pounds per day of gain, whereas only 0.8 for the full bloom. So that illustrates what the previous slide showed as well about as quality got lower, performance got lower as well, and those measures of protein went down and fiber went up. What's possible during winter months? Concentrate feeding can be increased. It's possible to balance some poorer quality forage by increasing grain in the diet. Remember, when you do that, it's always important to maintain adequate fiber levels. If fiber levels are too low, then there might be some digestive disorders when feeding a ruminant animal, a cow, sheep, or a goat. We want that adequate fiber in there so we can properly stimulate rumen fermentation and get the best proportion of fiber that's going to make that happen. Stockpiling of fall forage is a great opportunity. By that I mean, if we come to the end of the summer and there's extra forage growth in our fields, and say around early September, we might pull the cattle out of those fields and let the forage continue to grow, and we will stockpile the growth in the field the fields where we pull the animals out. And as it stockpiles, we're gonna be stockpiling some available forage. And then as it grows later in the fall of the winter, we're going to have extra forage for animals to graze on those stockpiled forages. Generally, we're going to be doing this with cool season grasses, such as Dr. Williams mentioned a few minutes ago. Cool season grass patches that are orchard grass, possibly fescue, ryegrass, brome grass. Those are all forages that can be stockpiled for later fall feeding. So that's one way we can extend some forage supplies, some feed supplies during the winter. Cover crops. There's fall cover crops, and when I'm saying cover crops, I mean mostly small grains such as wheat, rye, barley perhaps, that can be planted late in the summer and will give some fall growth. that animals can graze, especially wheat, I think, that animals can graze during the again during the late fall, October, November, December. There's other things you can. Legumes might be a good part of a mix of a small grain mix, as well as some people have planted brassicas, such as kale or turnips. These can be good feeds during the, if again, they've got to be established probably back in September, early part of September, and animals will consume those. Sheep might actually pull the turnip right out of the ground and consume the root. But we tried turnips on campus a few years ago, and we had some growth emerge, but we had such a deer overpopulation that they consumed a lot of the turnips. If you have questions about that, get some guidance before you jump into a program like that, especially with the brassicas. Get some guidance from your county extension agent. There's always some byproduct feeds that are available. And Dr. Williams mentioned some of these a few moments ago, and these have forage replacement value. They can replace our forages when we don't have enough, make a good substitute. They're often good sources of fiber, sometimes good sources of energy and protein as well, and they're often highly digestible. Byproducts are another good way to extend our forage supplies in the fall months, in the winter months. Apple pomace is a byproduct of apple processing, where juices or other apple products might be made. The pulp is dehydrated and can be a good feed. I think it's similar quality to beet pulp. Of course, beet pulp is what's remaining, the pulp remaining from sugar beet processing for making refined sugar. And beet pulp's a great feed. It's, as Dr. Williams mentioned, it can be used for horses. It's a good feed for cattle. It's been fed to cattle since they've been processing sugar beets and making pulp. It's been fed to cattle, but it can be fed to sheep and goats as well. It's fairly low in protein, but it's high in a very, what I'm going to call, digestible fiber, and it's a good stimulant of rumen fermentation. Brewer's grain is probably the most common byproduct within the state of New Jersey, coming from brew pubs or microbrews. There's somewhere in excess of probably 100 microbrews or brew pubs in the state, and a lot of those already dispose of some of their grains with farmers. That's a good option. Brewer's grain is a good protein source. It's a good fiber source, and it's again, it's fairly digestible form of fiber. It's not as high in energy as some other feeds. Corn cobs, again, a good source of digestible fiber if you can get them. Cottonseed hulls are what remains of the cotton after it's been processed. The cotton has been removed mostly. The cotton seed has been removed, so you just have the hull. It's pretty much pure fiber. There's not a lot of energy and protein remaining in it, but it's a good fiber source. And if you need to get fiber in the diet, cottonseed hulls can be a good way to do so. Soybean hulls, byproduct of soybean processing, again, a very good digestible form of fiber. Whole cottonseed is often used to feed dairy cows. It's commonly used for dairy. It's high in protein, high in fat, high in fiber. It's very complete sort of energy feed, protein feed, fiber feed. You have to be careful feeding it. If you feed too much of it, it's got a toxin in it called gossypol that can be toxic to animals. You'd never want to feed this to a horse, but to a dairy animal or a beef animal, they can detoxify some of that gossypol within the rumen, and it can be very good feed. Just little care is needed in knowing how much to feed. So if that's something you want to feed your animals, research it out ahead of time before you do so. Wheat straw. Wheat straw, when combined with some other of these byproducts, could almost mimic the value of good quality hay. Wheat straw, we like wheat straw because it's a good form of long fiber. Some long fiber is good in the diet of ruminants, and so if that's available, again, it's mostly fiber. It doesn't have much energy or protein, but it does have value. Wheat middlings, product of wheat processing, again a fiber source that's probably similar to soybean hulls, and a variety of products. All of these can replace forage value, and in addition to their forage value, they can be, some of them, like I said, can be mixed together, and you can have something that will approximate the value of hay or another forage. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about animal requirements. I like to share this slide because it gives a good understanding of the relationship between an animal's maintenance requirements. Maintenance requirements is the amount of, in this case, energy required for that animal to carry out basic functions, basic body functions. Doesn't include extra energy for pregnancy, lactation, or anything else. But it's that blue line, that's their maintenance requirement. Now when you add in the requirement for lactation in the red line, you'll see that this period after calving earlier in the year, the requirements go up on that red line as the animal needs more energy, and as the animal gets out here 7-8 months when the calf is weaned, of course the lactation level it's gone, it decreases. At the same time, the pregnancy or the gestation requirement at the time of breeding, say 3 to 4 months, if it's a spring calving, as this is a spring calving animal, it starts to increase until it gets to this high level of energy requirement that the animal has, and that's the time when the animal is going to give birth. And I like the way it kind of, this black line kind of sums everything. You got the blue line that's the maintenance, and you got the black line that goes on above that, and you see the requirements are highest early in the season, right after calving, and when lactation is at its peak. That kind of comes down through breeding. The animal is weaned, no longer lactating, and then as the calf, the fetus, begins to grow, the requirements increase again. So I think an understanding of this graph will help you as you feed animals. You'll know that if you've got a spring calving animal that's calving, that's say in this early part of the winter, probably in March, you know that as you get into the next fall and winter, your requirements are going to be increasing. So as you hit the winter, maybe you're getting some of the higher requirements, higher energy needs that the animal has, and when that happens, you might also have some forage. Might be needing forage. You might not have enough available forage. So then that's the situation where you might have to look at some of these other strategies that we talked about. Another way to look at the same thing is just look at it again. We're gonna talk about a 12-month cycle for a spring calving cow. That year one, that number one on the graph, we're gonna assume that's we're just gonna say that's January in this case. So gestation requirements are increasing until calving. Then the animal's maintenance requirements are gonna increase during breeding and lactation. And late gestation and late lactation. We're going to wean the animal, and the requirements will be less, and then they're going to increase again as the animal begins to gestate and gets on towards calving again. So this checked line, this dashed line, is the maintenance requirements. These are the requirements needed for production. So it's good. in my mind, to have that kind of that schematic out there for you, so you can see how the requirements of a gestating and a lactating cow are going to change over the course of the year, and you need to be able to balance your forage and available feed requirements to do that. Now, this is an animal that's already calved. This animal is certainly on the thin side. You look through the rear end here. You see that her rear legs, the back of her rear legs, are through her, I guess, the stifle, the side of the rear leg, pretty thin. She doesn't have a lot of condition on there. Her hips. You look close. Her hips are very they're protruding. They're sharp. Her tail head and her pins are sharp. She looks to be pretty sharp over the withers, even though she's covered with a lot of winter hair coat. Kind of thin through the neck. So this animal has lost a lot of condition after she's given birth, and she's going to need to gain some condition back. But this cow has done one thing that we like. In spite of her condition and in spite of everything, she's got a calf at her side, and probably every bit of energy she's got on her body is going to feed that calf. So of course we like that. Now, an animal that's thin such as that, of course, some of this is based on body condition scoring, a 1 to 9 scale, and a thin cow is going to be at the bottom of that scale. That animal may need to gain between 200 and 350 pounds if it's an animal that's actually thinner than this one, even emaciated. Economics might be questionable. But this animal that we showed you a picture of is probably going to need to gain a couple hundred pounds in addition to the weight of the calf she's going to have to when she gets pregnant again. Here's kind of a borderline animal. Again, you can see some sharpness over the hips and the pins, some outline of her ribs. So she's thinner, but she's not as thin as that previous cow. And again, she's going to need to gain some weight as well. Now, these are more what I'm going to call good condition cows. They're acceptable. If our animals are in this condition prior to calving, we're pretty happy about it. Up on the left you got the Santa Gertrudis cow, and then on the bottom you got Simmental, I guess, and they're all looking like they've got decent amounts of condition. So they're going to need to gain the weight of the fetus. They're not going to be like these other animals. They're going to have to gain a lot more than just the weight of the fetus as they grow. And then, of course, we have some animals that are too fat. Now, this Angus here, see, she's kind of pudgy and blocky. She's kind of squares off. And again, in all likelihood, she's a great cow that produces a calf every year, but she's certainly more conditioned than we'd like her to carry. Same with this little Hereford here, carrying too much condition. Animals like that are probably going to need to gain some or lose some weight. In this case, depending on how heavy they are, they might have to lose up to 100 or 200 pounds. Or we would like them to. Again, put this in a kind of a schematic in the course of a year that at pre-calving the animal is going to be, we'd like them to be in this kind of optimum condition like this animal is. When they calve, they're going to lose some condition. When they start to continue to lactate and get in the breathing season, they may lose a little bit more condition. But then later in the lactation, as they wean the animal, they're going to start to put more condition back on the body. So again, try to keep that kind of a schematic in your mind there, that looking at the life cycle of the animal. And how much do we need to be feeding an animal? I would say for an 1,100 pound beef cow, which is probably pretty much an average sort of beef cow, maybe low for some breeds, but Dry cow in the last third of pregnancy is probably going to need hay daily, maybe 22, 23 pounds of hay. Now that's assuming that the cow's getting good quality hay and maybe getting nothing else in their diet except maybe a mineral mix of some kind, vitamin mineral mix in their feed. A mature cow nursing a calf probably is going to need over 30 pounds of a good quality hay per day to be able to feed the calf and to maintain their own body weight. And again, if hay is of poor quality or there's not enough of it, that animal's probably going to have to be supplemented with something else, either a better quality hay or grain mix. And again, we measure energy in a couple different ways. The classical way to measure energy for beef cows is by what we call TDN, total digestible nutrients. And I think that's still, when it comes to feeding beef cows, not maybe beef steers, beef growing animals, we still often talk about TDN, or total digestible nutrients. We also talk sometime about an energy measurement called megacals, megacalories of net energy, and you can see in both of those as they go from last third of pregnancy to nursing, they have to have increased amounts of energy in the diet and increased amounts of protein as well. How about a ewe, 125 pound ewe? You know, last part of pregnancy, a ewe might require, say, maybe 4 or 5 pounds of hay. As she starts to lactate, she's going to need a little bit more than that, maybe 5 or 6 pounds of hay, of good quality hay. And again, you can see the changes in energy and protein requirements as well. Well, how about winter feeding? Winter can give us some challenges when we're feeding animals, all species of animals. But we're talking a little bit right now about cows. This is a nice picture of some steers that are up at the feed bunk. It's snowy. It's probably a little bit cold and windy at the same time, and they're eating away at their feed mix. Probably a combination of silage and hay and concentrate mix and protein mix, and I often mention to students in class, we'll talk about the thermal neutral zone, and I don't want you to lose yourself in this slide, but just I want you to look up at the left towards the top. It says lower critical temperature. That line that goes by the gray shaded area in the middle there, the thermal neutral area, when the temperature falls below that line, what we'll call lower critical temperature, the animal is going to need more energy to maintain their bodily functions, especially their body heat. So how are they going to do that? Well, they might take some of their weight off their body to maintain their body heat. We might give them more feed to do so. As it shows up here, feed intake will be greater during that period of time. So when we hit that thermal neutral area, we're going to call the lower critical temperature. When the animal gets below that, and that's true of all of our domestic animals, they're gonna need more energy in their diets for a given level of performance or production. And we call those thermal neutral zones. Just looking for the cattle up at the top there, and this is going to be a cow in the winter with a normal winter coat, and their critical temperature is going to be 32 degrees. So if they're above 32 degrees and they've got a good winter coat, they're not going to be you're not going to have to give extra feed just to keep them warm, just to maintain their body heat. Calves, it's a little higher. of course, sheep are a little bit more variable because of wool and whether or not they've been shorn. But for cattle, just kind of use that 32 degrees as we move on into the next slide. A cow with a summer coat or a wet coat, that critical temperature is going to be 59 degrees Fahrenheit, at least as this research study showed it. 59 degrees Fahrenheit. When they have a fall coat, getting some more coat, some more cover, and a winter coat, of course, a winter coat, that lower temperature is going to be 32 degrees. If they've got a heavy winter coat, they can down to 18 degrees while they're still going to maintain that thermal neutral zone, stay in that thermal neutral zone. Of course, the air temperature can make a big difference. The air temperature and the wind speed can make a big difference. Up at the top axis here, it just lists the temperature, and on the left it lists the wind speed, and you can see that all the way across. And I apologize, on the bottom there you've lost some numbers there, but just about all the way across from zero wind speed up to 20 miles per hour, the wind chill level, or the basically drops 20 degrees all across. So if it's 39, it drops to 19. If it's 25, it drops to 3. If it's 10, it drops to -9 as the wind chill increases. So again, that's I think that's a good thing to remind yourself that when you get to the winter months and it's cool, and then you get wind speed as well, there's going to be a lot more temperature stress upon the animal, and you're going to have to feed them accordingly. Now, mud brings in another challenge entirely. This is a pretty muddy environment, and as things get to this level of mud, mud's going to get caked on the animal. It's going to permeate into the hide, into the hair coat, and the hair coat's not going to insulate the body as well as it did. Okay, you're going to lose some of that insulating value of the hair coat, and so what might have been a dry winter hair coat protecting the body, now that the animal's wet and muddy, or if they lie in mud, it's gonna change that, and the cold stretch's going to be more of a stress upon them. Okay, about and this kind of takes a couple slides back. We looked about the wind speed and the temperature and how it changed the effective temperature due to the wind. If we go from the effective temperature of 30 degrees to -10, we're going to need extra energy requirements. So if 30 degrees is that lower critical temperature at the beginning of that thermal neutral zone, they don't need any extra energy. But if it drops to -10 degrees, they need 40% more energy to maintain themselves. So how much extra grain or hay is that? Well, extra hay, it's 7 to 8 pounds. Extra grain, maybe 4 to 5 pounds when they get down to that level. And feeding's a little bit different for hay and for grain. Sometimes animals might not be able to consume as much hay as is needed to get that extra energy. So you might actually grain or a combination of grain and hay might be the better mix if it gets cold enough. Well, just a listing of things that, as we close up here, that I think are important to remember. Management factors, of course, monitor the weather, monitor the temperature, and increase grain feeding if it gets cold enough. As animals are in their last trimester, getting prepared to calve, maintenance requirements are increasing, energy requirements are increasing. You might have to give some extra feed when it gets cold enough. Build windbreaks, do something, protect the animals from the wind. Wind's going to reduce the temperature and cold stress is going to increase. Make sure you bed the animals properly. Bed's going to counteract the effects of mud. You're gonna have your animals bedded on straw or something, and it's gonna keep them out of the wet and out of the mud, and hopefully it'll warm them up a bit too. Again, keep your animals clean and dry. Avoid wet coats when you can by having some sort of shelter or windbreak. Again, those mud-caked coats are going to be a problem. Provide additional feed if needed, hay and grain. Make sure that wet feeds are not frozen, and provide water. Probably the first sign of an animal needing water is when they stop eating, or potentially one of the first signs is they stop eating. So make sure you've got ample water for the animals, and try to keep it somewhat warmer if you can. It doesn't need hot or even warm, but just frozen water is you want it to be warmer than that, and so maybe some sort of a electric thaw heater or whatever you want to call it, or waterers that maintain heat that comes from a geothermal type of a approach with the waterer. So just an overview on livestock water use. A mature lactating dairy cow probably needs 30 to 40 gallons a day. Non-lactating dairy cows and beef cows in that range of 15 to 25 gallons. Sheep or goats 2 to 3 gallons per day. So try to ensure that your animals get that amount of water on a daily basis. And again, if animals reach higher levels of production, certainly a dairy cow, when they're producing a lot of milk, they're going to need more. They may need more than that 30 to 40 gallons per day. With that, that's the end of my presentation. I've enjoyed it. Please send me any comments that you might have. Any comments, email me here, and hope you have a great day.
Well, thank you, Dr. Westendorf and Dr. Williams, for your presentations. Been monitoring the chat. I don't see any questions. I know we're over the time, but if anybody has any quick questions they want to ask. And if you don't think of something, you can always send me a message, and we can send it to the right panelist to answer your questions in the future.
I do see one question for me that I can answer for everybody, if you are okay with that. It just says, a general rule, do rugs, meaning I guess blankets, eliminate wind chill on clipped or unclipped horses as windbreakers seem to us. And I assume that that's a feed consideration in horses in the winter. And yeah, I didn't get into thermal regulation at all with horses, but particularly with clipped horses, they should definitely be blanketed based on the temperature. I know tonight, it's supposed to get into the 20s, as is tomorrow. If your horse is clipped, you definitely should be blanketing them, and more than just a rain sheet. It should have something with a little more fill to it. If it's raining as well, it should definitely have a blanket. Now, there is some controversy with unclipped horses, whether they really should be blanketed or not. And the problem is, once you start blanketing them in the winter, even if they're unclipped, you pretty much need to continue, because what you've done is you've decreased the loft. So hair has a loft to it when it grows, and it traps the warm air body heat within that loft. Well, you put a blanket on it, and you've now pushed down all the hair. So now it doesn't have any loft to it, and it doesn't have that insulating property. So once you start blanketing, even if it is an unclipped horse, you really need to continue. It's good to have them blanketed when it's raining, but then you're kind of stuck with continuing to blanket them. And this time of year is really hard because, you know, when we hit 60 degrees on Friday and through the weekend, they don't need a blanket. So you know, it really depends on your management, what you're going to be able to do. We also see something about endophytes. What labs test for endophytes in the hay? I don't know about any other labs, but I know Equine or Dairy One does do an endophyte test. I don't know, Mike, does Cumberland Valley test
I
for
don't know.
endophytes?
I don't know if they do. No.
I would assume they might, but I know Equine and you can look them up. I'll type it in the question area. I think that's all I see.
Same. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for participating in our 2-day webinar series. If you, like I said, if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out. Thanks and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.